I'm Richard McLennan. I'm of the Department of Psychology, the current head of the Department of Psychology, and our guest speaker, Dr. John Connors. Is going to be, there's quite a few Conways laying around. Dr. John Connor is going to be talking a little bit about one of our former heads, Dr. Duncan Blewett, and also a little bit about the history of the department. I've been showing Dr. Connor around the campus a little bit. He's been asking me all sorts of questions about the history of our department, and I kind of recognize that I know nothing about the history of our department after all his questions. And I think it's sort of very valuable to sort of take a pause and reflect back on the previous accomplishments of members of our department and to understand where we currently are as a department. So I just want to quickly read his bio if he didn't have a chance to look at it himself. I probably should get Amy Hampton to come up here and introduce Dr. Connor.
Is Amy Hampton here? I've been looking for her.
Yes. Personal family friend.
I need you to talk into his lapel mic so I can get him on the recording. So you just stand next to him.
Okay.
Just stand next to him.
As I mentioned, Amy Hampton comes from Colloquium, Alberta as well, and also is a kind of personal family friend with Dr. Connors and his family. But Dr. Connors is presently a professor of psychology at Canadian University College in Colloquium, Alberta. He grew up in New Jersey and then worked as a school psychologist in Michigan before moving to Canada in 1991. He has a BA in psychology from Rutgers University and MA Ed.DS and PhD from Western Michigan University. In a small school or university, it's often necessary to be a journalist, and so he teaches quite a lot of courses in areas of clinical counseling psychology, experimental psychology, and of course his area of research is in the history of psychology. He's a registered psychologist in Alberta since 2003 and has a small counseling practice. And for the past 4 summers, he's been doing similar type of research on the history of the Department of Psychology at Dalhousie University as well. And he often presents his research at the Canadian Psychological Association. He's a member of the section on history of Canadian psychology. I guess you've been head of that section for a few times. Mm-hmm. And so it's really valuable for us to have a person who's a real expert in history of psychology to tell us a little bit about ourselves and our department. So please welcome Dr. Connor.
Thank you, Jake. It's a pleasure to be here in beautiful Regina, Saskatchewan. Coming from Alberta, we often look west rather than east, but I've been quite impressed with the community and went for a jog around Westcona Lake yesterday, and it's quite amazing. Sorry. So, when I moved to Canada 20 years ago, the only Canadian psychologists I knew were maybe Wilder Penfield and Donald Hebb, and Penfield wasn't even a psychologist. So I've been fascinated to learn how many major discoveries in psychology come from either Canadians or research sponsored by Canadians. I think we sometimes undervalue our own contributions to the discipline. 4 years ago at CPA in Winnipeg, in 2010, I gave a talk on LSD research in Saskatchewan, more from the Saskatoon perspective, talking about Abe Hoffer and Humphrey Osmond, and a little bit about Duncan Blewett. But then last year, when I was at CPA in Quebec City, I ran into Bill Smythe, and he said, somebody needs to talk about Duncan. So I started to look into it. I thought, I don't know whether I have enough for a talk. And then I started looking into things. And I started to talk with his family, his colleagues, former students, looking up articles and books. And now I not only have enough for a talk, I can do an article, probably a book chapter, maybe even eventually an entire book. Talked to my colleagues in the department. Nobody had ever heard of Duncan Blewett. He said, who's he? He's from Regina. Well, why should we know about him? At one time, Regina was considered maybe a backwater of Canada, but I'm quite impressed with the city. You've got it's beautifully laid out with wonderful architecture, parks, and very friendly and helpful people. I've been more than blessed by being here. Now, you should know that almost everything I'm talking about today I did not learn in grad school. In fact, my psych program at Western Michigan University was very behavioristic. We only used humanism as a foil to talk against Freudianism or something like that. So, but Duncan Blewett is an unusual character, and he has not received the recognition that he deserves. Some of his stuff is a little bit far out, but he had such a creative, curious mind that nothing was something that he wouldn't at least consider. And I think that's what we need to do as university instructors, to move students beyond their level of comfortness, and you have to at least consider everything we talk about. So let's get started here. I tried to look for some psychedelic wallpaper here, put you guys in the mood. Okay, this is called Psychedelic Research in Saskatchewan in the 1950s. You should know I presented 2 talks to CPA in Vancouver next June. They only accepted one and did not accept my talk on Duncan Blewett. It's maybe a little too hot to handle, so, but I actually have more time to talk here, so, and I think people here would be more interested, so I'm glad to do this here. Probably some of you have seen this documentary, The Psychedelic Pioneers, showing pictures of Blewett, Osmond, and Hoffer. If you haven't seen it, it's one of 3 well-done documentaries that have been done in the last couple of years, and I understand some of the faculty here have shown this in class. It is surprising that in the 1950s, Saskatchewan was considered the world center for LSD research. From 1952 till at least the mid-60s or 67, I think it wasn't banned in Canada until 69, the use of LSD ranged from leading-edge psychiatric research into schizophrenia and alcoholism to volunteer testing on the general public, and it went from being a wonder drug to a public menace. And we'll look at that. But remember, around 1950, there were no drugs out. There were a few barbiturates or other drugs that required large doses. But here was a drug that with just a very minute dose could make profound changes in people's perceptions. It was colorless, odorless, tasteless, and it's not addictive, and for the most part, it's not dangerous as long as it's not taken in combination with other drugs or alcohol, and as long as the person has no history of mental illness. So the 3 psychedelic pioneers, or the 3 musketeers, were Blewett, Hoffer, and Osmond. Humphrey Osmond has the famous catchphrase, "To fall in hell or soar angelic, you need a pinch of psychedelic." And that became a catchphrase back in the 60s. Blewett is quoted as saying, "The government makes $11 million a year in Saskatchewan off liquor. They could double that off LSD without any trouble at all." And if you read about some of the tax revenue in Colorado recently with marijuana, the Canadian government may wish to rethink some of its drug policies. Why give money to the Mexican cartels when we could have it for ourselves, right? Duncan Bassett Blewett was born in February 20, 1928 in Edmonton, Alberta. His parents were John Blewett and Bessie Campbell. They ran a boarding house in Edmonton. Bessie was 16 years old when she married John, who was 12 years older. Now, his father was a little crazy himself. He was an explorer. He went up to the Yukon looking for gold. He was drilling for oil. He went down and looked for oil down in Alabama to sell land to the Tennessee Valley Association. He worked all over. Blewett was the youngest of three. He had an older brother, John, who was a lawyer, and an older sister, Jean, who was a dietitian in Moose Jaw. His paternal grandfather, Bassett Collins Blewett, was a naturalist in Ontario, and his paternal grandmother was Jean McKishie Blewett, who was a well-known journalist who published poems, short stories, and articles for the Toronto Daily Globe, as well as 3 volumes of poetry and 4 novels. The town of Blewett, Saskatchewan, is named after Blewett's paternal grandmother. Blewett grew up like a lot of Canadian boys interested in sports such as hockey, football, soccer, track and field, triple jump. His family moved a lot because his father was always looking for new get-rich-quick schemes. In fact, he enjoyed sports so much when they moved to Ontario, stayed an extra year just so he could be on the teams. In fact, he got so involved, we don't think he ever graduated from high school. So how many U of R professors don't have a high school diploma now, right? So in 1942, his parents moved to White Rock, British Columbia, right after Duncan and his brother joined the Canadian Army in 1941. Here's a picture of him when he was younger, sort of playing army with a friend. Duncan was 5'8", his friend was 6'6", so it almost looks like one of those optical illusion experiments, right? And have you been to Bull Falls, near the Banff Springs Hotel in Michigan? In Alberta. Here's Duncan Blewett on the right as a teenager, his brother John, and his mother. So that's a famous tourist site if you're ever out west. Blewett joined the Canadian Army in 1941, so he probably never graduated from high school. He enlisted in the infantry in the Kent Regiment in Chatham, had basic training on the exhibition grounds in Toronto. Due to his intelligence and educational success, he was transferred to the Signal Corps in Kingston, Ontario. And when his unit was sent to Britain a year later, at a track meet, he was offered a commission if he joined the Manitoba Dragoons in the Artillery Corps. In 1943, his unit fought the Germans in southern Italy. He was sent back briefly due to getting sick, and then sent back, rejoined the unit in the fight for Holland. When armistice with Japan was declared, actually when Germany surrendered on May 8th, 1945, Blewett was in London. And it was just awesome that people would come out of their shelters. They didn't have to worry about being bombed. It was like a new age, a new day. It was almost like altered state of consciousness. There was a lot of optimism that there would be no wars and there would be peace and understanding. Blewett didn't actually like the regimentation of Army life, and he decided to become a pacifist and a Quaker as a result of his war experiences. Here's some pictures of him in the Army. He's on the bottom far right. He's the third from the right there. Here is Duncan with his first wife, Irene Fleming, in 1941. There they are again, holding his niece. When the war ended, you had a choice. You could take a lump sum of money from the Canadian government, or there was something like the Canadian GI Bill where they would send you to university. Blewett and his wife took the train out west to join his parents in White Rock, BC, right on the Pacific Ocean, and decided to start studies at the University of British Columbia. trying to decide on a major, and he was the only one that didn't have an early morning class, so he picked psychology. I don't know if that's still here at U of R, where there's no morning classes, but that was the initial enticement. He'd been like through grade 13 in Ontario, so he finished school in 2.5 years, graduated in 47, and then the GI Bill still continued, so he went on for his master's degree. Many of his professors had had military service back then, so they were very favored to help the ex-soldiers to get through. He was really good in math, and a lot of his teachers were in statistics, and he did a MA thesis using correlation coefficients on occupational interests for the armed services trade. What area of the Air Force or Army or Navy would you like to go into? It was a very pedestrian study, nothing really very exciting. UBC in the 1950s was basically just a woods on a little peninsula going out into the ocean, and it was more woods than buildings back then, and they actually didn't have much of a department back then. Here he is graduating with his bachelor's degree, looking very happy and very young, and very traditional, very straight-laced, nothing different about him. Duncan met Irene Fleming in high school. She was teaching in a one-room schoolhouse briefly nearby, while Blewett took on an extra year in high school so he could play sports. At that time, if a guy was going into the services, there was often quick marriages, so that when the guy got back after the war, you'd already have your marriage arranged. I've heard that Irene's mother didn't approve of Duncan very much, and they actually had to elope. So no high school diploma, had to elope, was on sick leave in the Army, not a good beginning. While he was out in school, his 2 children, John and Mary, were born. And there's a picture of the Blewetts with their young children out in White Rock, BC. And there's Blewett with his mother, and then his sister and brother-in-law over there at an early stage. His advisors recommended that he go study with Hans Eysenck, who was a real big name back then at the University of London. He was very much into nature-nurture studies with twins and doing different sorts of analysis of variance. And interestingly, when Blewett went over there, he was funded by the Eugenics Society. He studied some identical and fraternal twins and looked at the correlation coefficient between neuroticism and intelligence. He finished like in 17, 18 months, really quickly, and then he was recommended to study with another big name back then, Raymond Cattell at the University of Illinois for factor analysis research. So the family moved. Fellow student was John Beloff, who became very famous in parapsychology research later on. They published a paper where they did a factor analysis of different personality factors using Air Force test data. Again, very pedestrian. When you read through it, it just seems pretty straightforward. One of his friends was Neil Agnew, who told him about a job back in Canada and wrote a letter of recommendation for him. So in 1953, Blewett was hired by the Department of Public Health as the chief psychologist of psychiatric services. He was responsible for the supervision of psychologists who treated mental patients at the Monroe wing of the Regina Psychiatric Hospital, and also had to travel around the province to other provincial hospitals, as well as some training schools. At home, he enjoyed playing trivia games. He was fascinated with all the railroad lines in Saskatchewan. I guess there aren't as many now, but you could travel all over the province at that time. Liked watching foreign films. He occasionally did curling, and he and his wife had Scottish dances in their basement on weekends to socialize. Other than that, he really didn't have many hobbies. He didn't even follow sports anymore. Of course, there wasn't TV then. They did attend a Quaker meeting house on Sunday. His wife Irene taught children with what were called mental deficiencies at the Harold de Groot School. I'm not sure if that's still around. While their children attended public school, and both of them later took classes from their dad at the University of Regina. In the 1950s, Saskatchewan was quite a radical place. There was new public policies, new medical ideas, and Premier Tommy Douglas had a personal interest in mental health. He actually did a master's degree in that area and wanted to emphasize preventative medicine and professional collaboration. They recruited medical researchers for provincial civil service. Griff McKercher was important because he came out and protected all the people who were doing LSD research. I think Colin Smith worked with him, and they were both supportive of any new innovative research. Of course, there was a lot of stereotypes of mental illness back then, and there were separate medical hospitals and psychiatric hospitals, and they talked about maybe merging the facilities so they could work more collaboratively. So when Hoffman and Osmond asked permission to use psychopharmacological studies with alcoholics and schizophrenics, they were given the green light. What? LSD, psilocybin, mescaline? Go for it. The Weyburn Hospital soon began asking for volunteers. The Sandoz pharmaceutical company in Montreal was sending out free wooden boxes of glass vials of LSD free to anyone who wanted to do medical research with it. So we'd take it out of there, sort of break off the top, and you'd pour it into a glass of water, and you just drink the water. Now, it could be injected intravenously or maybe with a patch, but this was how it was first done. And I hear some of those boxes are still around, so people still have a cache. Agnew went out to the University of Toronto to get his PhD, but returned in '56. Agnew and Hoffman originally working at the Weyburn Hospital, transferred to Saskatoon, and they wanted to use mescaline and LSD to model delirium tremens in alcoholics and psychotic episodes in schizophrenics. They got grants from the National Institute of Mental Health and the Canadian Mental Health Association. They were able to buy a house for the Psychological Research Center right across from campus. Duncan was Agnew's nominal supervisor, but supervision consisted of driving up to Saskatoon and going out and having a beer together in a bar. I don't know if current supervisors are that lax these days, but back then, anything goes, right? Agnew and Duncan took LSD together as early as 1956, and Blewett became so intrigued he became a volunteer for LSD experiments. Back then, if you gave LSD to patients, the psychiatrists, the psychologists, the nurses, they all took it with you. So, when was the last time your psychiatrist said, "I'll take the antidepressant with you"? He and Agnew also went to meetings at the beginning of the Psychological Association of Saskatchewan. Blewett was not the founder, it was Morgan Wright, but Blewett became an editor for the newsletter that should be the Saskatchewan Psychologist. But as editor, he also wrote satirical articles and even had a prank. Apparently, he took a patient from the Weyburn Mental Hospital who was schizophrenic and filled in an application so he could join the Saskatchewan Psychological Association. When they found out 3 or 4 years later, they were not amused, and actually for a while threw him out. saying they didn't like that sort of humor. Blewett also spent a month at a corrections institute in Regina trying LSD with psychopathic people who were prisoners. The chief of police in Regina, again, was not amused and thought that you should not coddle prisoners, that they just deserve the whip more than anything else. Blewett developed an assessment scale, the Weyburn assessment scale, using 7 broad behavioral categories, which were scored on a 3-point scale, administered by 3 psychiatrists to 40 male chronic schizophrenics. He used his statistical background to determine reliability and validity, and he wanted to use actual behaviors instead of symptoms to avoid the halo effect in diagnosis. You know the difference between signs and symptoms? Symptoms are what are reported by the patient. The signs are what are observed by the clinician. His revised scale was used to assess degree of illness in schizophrenic patients, and so it would be useful in measuring the therapeutic effects of LSD. Abe Hoffer is actually from Saskatchewan. He was a biochemist who determined that LSD contained nicotinic acid, which appeared to antagonize or block the metabolism of specific enzymes. By adjusting the levels of nicotinic acid in the body, he demonstrated it was possible to control perceptual reaction to LSD. In fact, if you were having too strong an LSD trip, if he administered some nicotinic acid, it would sort of bring you down a bit. Osmond was more involved in the psychological effects of LSD, but Hoffer and Osmond were a great team and really put Saskatchewan on the map back then. Blewett was to use prison volunteers, hospitalized alcoholics, and even student volunteers, but I don't find evidence that he ever gave it to schizophrenics himself. Agnew and Hoffer published their first LSD study in 1954, where they combined LSD and nicotinic acid to modify psychoses in 5 subjects. Blewett teamed up with a Saskatoon psychiatrist, Nicholas Chevalos, to study using LSD to treat chronic alcoholics. In 1959, they teamed up with research psychiatrist Colin Smith and Abe Hoffer to publish a study of 24 patients at the University Hospital in Saskatoon. Interestingly, they noted that alcoholics showed less response to LSD than did non-alcoholic volunteers, so larger doses were used. A normal person would get maybe about 100 milligrams, where the alcoholics would get anywhere from 200 to 400. Each patient was asked to write up an account of their experiences the next day, and somebody stayed with them, recording their reactions. The first times they just did them in very sterile hospital rooms, but pretty soon they tried to make them more comfortable, even using motels and other places, and added environmental stimuli such as classical music, cut flowers, visual art, photographs of relatives. The person was told to lie down, relax, and listen closely, told what to expect. The LSD trip often lasted 8 to 10 hours, and the person or a sitter would stay with the person the entire time. Frequently, a discussion of religion developed as a result of queries about these unusual experiences. What were the effects of LSD in research subjects? Well, Blewett made up a whole list, such as a feeling of being at one with the universe and changes in understanding of philosophy and religion, increased sensitivity to the feelings of others, changes in perception of space and time. Now, there were some negative effects, like hallucinations, delusions of reference, severe anxiety, perceptual distortions, but fortunately the negative effects did not last very long, maybe no more than 20 or 30 minutes. So for most people, if they weren't previously depressed, suicidal, or mentally ill, they were in a very controlled environment and somebody stayed with them the entire time, they were not adverse effects. They use a term called psychotomimetic because some of these drugs made similar reactions to maybe delirium tremens in alcoholics, or different sort of hallucinations and delusions in schizophrenics. There are things like escape reactions. There could be nausea, palpitations, constriction of the throat, headaches, numbness of limbs. They could get a very confusional state and perceptual distortions. Visual imageries and ideas will flood into your awareness so rapidly that you can't rationalize them. And of course, they can become overwhelming. And when overwhelming, they could be frightening and unpleasant. Paranoid thinking could sometimes occur where you get feeling overly dependent on others, and you don't want to be left alone. Many people felt like they had enhanced intellectual capacity and a new empathy to empathize and understand others. You feel like you're sort of on the edge, but most people can hold it in. Many people interpreted the experience as offering rich and new interpretations for reality. They felt strongly there's a unifying principle underlying all things, an essence in which he feels control. These feelings or beliefs are accompanied by feelings of reality so intense that conviction is inevitable. These different classifications show that LSD 25 or mescaline-induced experiences, which were vast and rapidly shifting, communalities in the experience will eventually offer a scientific understanding in this area of experience. In 1959, Blewett and Nick Choulos, I spelled it wrong there, published a handbook for the therapeutic use of LSD, individual and group procedures. For many years, this was the Bible for what you needed to look at if you're administering LSD to clients or if you're trying to take it yourself. It's been out of print for a long time, but you can still print out a copy online through the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies. It enabled other researchers to replicate the procedure. It described the stages of the experience, common reactions, assessment, a scale, problems and assessment, and how to handle diminishment of symptoms. It also gave normative data comparing alcoholics to normals. Here is Duncan Blewett in 1961 when he began teaching at the University of Regina. Pretty handsome guy. In 1959, the Regina campus had only 295 students. That's smaller than most high schools. When a decision was made to establish a full degree granting program at the Regina College. It stood in the shadows of its much better funded sister school in Saskatoon, which we won't mention. And it was originally designed as an alternative with an emphasis on music, art, and liberal arts. In 1961, the principal of Regina College, William Riddell, asked Duncan Blewett to recommend a person to head up a new department of psychology. It's part of his plan to build up a liberal arts program. Blewett said, well, why not me? So the first year he was the only teacher in psychology, and they only offered 3 classes, I think 2 of which were intro or something. But Blewett remained the chair of psychology until 1970, and they went from 3 courses to 42 courses. There was phenomenal growth in the next few years, as 4 new professors were hired in 67, 3 more in 68, and 4 more in 69. They had a total of 16 faculty. That may be more than they have today. Most of the faculty, interestingly, were hired sight unseen. They never visited the campus. It was Blewett's vision to start the first humanistically-oriented psychology program in Canada. Blewett was a popular teacher, but he had an unusual teaching style. He had some sort of big sombrero hat that he'd wear in class. He had a cigar clenched to one side. He'd pace around the room. He would ask rhetorical questions. He sounded like Columbo. You remember Peter Falk in that show where you'd ask questions where you looked dumb, but you actually knew the answer and were leading the student in sort of a Socratic method to come up with the answer himself. He never used notes. He could speak off the cuff quite articulately. Often came to class high in marijuana. Many of us could lecture that way? I can't even lecture without notes. Courses that he taught, some were general, like intro and general experimental, but some, like personality and behavioral dynamics, the individual and the group. They often had encounter groups with students on weekends. And his favorite course is psychology of belief systems. He would hand out mimeograph chapters of his forthcoming book to use in class, and he would present different systems of thought, often as philosophical as psychological, but in the end he wanted to know what the student himself thought, what were the student's own beliefs. So that was the final term paper. And he also had a number of experiential sessions in class to make students sort of aware of their different states of consciousness themselves. 1966, he had his 25th wedding anniversary with his wife Irene, and as far as I can tell, it was a fairly happy marriage. Here's Duncan next to his mother and other people at a family gathering. But he started spending more and more time away from home, more at the office, more with his students, not coming home till late at night. So he sort of gradually disengaged himself from his home life, and his kids don't remember seeing him show up a lot of times for their events. He got involved quite a bit with a psychic medium named Eileen Garrett. In 1950, she was the world's most famous psychic, and she started something called the Parapsychology Foundation in New York City. She published a journal called New Horizons, and she had grant money to give people. In fact, sorry.
No, it sounded like it was just...
In fact, Neil Agnew initially helped get $20,000 research funding from Parapsychology Foundation back in the mid-50s, and for about 10 years, Blewett not only got research money from her, but attended parapsychology conferences in New York City, and she had a villa on the south of France where he would go and spend several weeks, and she had the swankiest dinner parties in New York City. She was considered high society back then. Garrett may have had some symptoms of dissociative identity disorder or delusions or hallucinations, but she made some incredible pronouncements. There was this famous R101 dirigible blimp that she predicted would blow up and destroy 2 years before that happened. And sure enough, on a trip over the English Channel from English to France, it blew up near Belgium, and 45 people on board were all killed. Later on, she was able to channel secret information from the pilot and describe technical details of the ship, which would have explained what were the engineering faults. She also subjected herself to a lot of experimentation by famous scientists because she didn't understand how she could channel people who were no longer living or that she did not know. She often went into a trance and didn't remember later. So she subjected herself to numerous tests and was very concerned to find a scientific explanation for her spiritual powers. Now, of course, there was a lot of misinformation about the effects of LSD back then, and the press went on a bit of a rampage. These may look like the tabloids, but none of this was even close to being true. Of course, it was a different time back then. Some of you are old enough to remember the musical Hair, which encouraged using mind-expanding drugs such as marijuana and LSD. I got to see it on Broadway. And the psychedelic film 2001, where the last 9 minutes of the movie was like an LSD trip. And many people would take marijuana or LSD or other mind-expanding drugs just to see the film. It became sort of a cult classic. But of course, that didn't add to its scientific reputation, I don't think. And there are a number of other documentaries made about this. This shows Albert Hofmann, the Swiss biochemist that originally discovered LSD in 1943 by accident. There's also a lot of psychedelic art from the 60s that, and even in art galleries, these became quite popular. Arthur Mackay from the Regina 7, right here, also took LSD and hoped that it would expand his creative output. Unfortunately, he went through bouts of depression, and it didn't really help his art as much as he would have liked to. But there was much art and music influenced by this back in the 60s. Now, I've never tried LSD, but I should tell you some of the actual effects. It can cause a lot of physical things like pupil dilation, close and open eye patterning, change thought patterns, feelings of insight, happiness, giddiness, anxiety, anger, joy, irritation. There's a slight feeling of energy in the body, an extra twinkle to lights, a feeling that things are somehow different than usual. Certainly, the perceptual distortions can be quite dramatic. Of course, we should talk about cautions about using LSD, that if you take it when you're not in a good mental and emotional state, if you're not in a safe environment, if you're not with somebody who helps you lead you through it, people need what's called a sober friend or sitter to watch out for you while you're on your trip. So unexpected stimuli can cause alarm. There's actually no real known negative side effects of LSD, especially from just one hit. This is related to the extremely tiny amounts that are psychoactive. There are certain cases where people have claimed to have visual tracers or flashbacks. However, this has never been proven and only happens with heavy prolonged use. LSD has been illegal for so long that a lot of the studies of it are decades old, but there has been evidence that it affects the central nervous system. One report said that the brain normally gets 11 million signals, perceptual signals, every second. But because of evolution, we block most of them out, only get about 200 of them. But LSD augments and mimics serotonin in a way that inhibitory neurons that block out those signals become relaxed, allowing the passage of thousands of extra signals. So some of these serotonin receptor types control memory, mood, pupil dilation, imagination, perception, vasoconstriction, sleep, locomotion, cognition, and agonist effects of LSD can produce enhanced memory recall, augmented mood, increased awareness of perception and central information, vasoconstriction, enhanced reflexes, abstract and broadly intertwined thought connections, and other things that become the LSD experience. Of course, it was Timothy Leary that said the only way to have sex was to be on LSD, that it augmented the experience. The book that changed everything. Blewett was handing out mimeograph chapters of a new book in classes for several years. Apparently, right around 1966, Abe Maslow spoke at a conference in Saskatoon, and the two of them met. Blewett also met Aldous Huxley, Alan Watts, corresponded with Timothy Leary, all sorts of other people. His book jacket said, "To live without fear, without hate, without anxiety." This is what Blewett proposed in his remarkable new book. The book combines perennial philosophy, the effects of psychedelic drugs, the importance of the unconscious as a source of ideas, love as the source of man's being, and peak experience of the transcendent state. Financial support from the book came from the Parapsychology Foundation. Here's a copy of the book. It's out of print, but I understand people are presently trying to get it reprinted. I paid $75 for a copy from a Winnipeg used bookstore. Maybe I could have gotten it cheaper, but... Some quotes from the book. This is one I like. In the final analysis, experience, not behavior, is the criterion measure for all facets of awareness, and hence for human beingness and understanding. The importance of experience relative to behavior is beyond question, for experience extends beyond behavior, just as feeling extends beyond the concepts of language. Also spoke about love transcending space and time, and he talked about the law of feeling as his sort of counter to Thorndike's law of effect or something. Blewett used his friend Robert and his former student and friend Robert Osborne to obtain a book contract with Universal Publishing and Distributing in New York City. He became a bit demanding when he requested over 200 free copies be sent to his colleagues, but didn't want to help defray costs. In the end, a total of over 62,000 copies were printed, but only around 14,000 were sold by 1978, and the book went out of print. Notably, it was not reviewed in any major psychology journal, and Blewett felt it had been neglected by both the publisher and the academic community. His royalty payments ended up being less than $1,000. He was a little incensed. He said, "I believe this book is the most articulate statement available in what is fast becoming one of the major areas of controversy in North American society, the non-medical use of psychedelic drugs." Blewett was kept busy in the first few years at Regina. He often taught 5 different classes a term. His vision was to build a very democratic system in which different systems of beliefs and orientation would all be given equal opportunity. As a result, he tried to hire faculty from every different persuasion he could think of. He hired socialists, Marxists, humanists, behaviorists, psychoanalysts, gestaltists, social psychologists, statisticians. Students were invited to faculty meetings and put on an even par with professors for decision-making. The Canadian musician Leonard Cohen was even invited to a department meeting and asked for his opinion. An unusual course taught by Dr. Buddy Wynn was Psych 300 Parapsychology. At one time, it was the most popular upper division course on campus. The problem with inviting people from a dozen different persuasions and wanting a democratic process is nobody can agree on anything. So eventually they split up into several different factions. They were arguing. They had several new department heads. And then the final department head, Dick Johnson, was told he had to resign, was told not to appear on campus for a year, and he unfortunately committed suicide. The department went into receivership for over 2 years before disagreements settled down. Today, as I can tell, there's little evidence that the psychology department's initial mission or emphasis is there, although it now has several well-respected doctoral programs. Counterculture influences. In 67 and 68, June Cosby was a new student who attended Gestalt therapy workshops at Esalen Big Sur with Fritz Perls. June became a student of Duncan Blewett, eventually his girlfriend, and eventually his wife. In 1970, they went with their friend Simon DeJong, later an MP in Ottawa, for a program called Kool-Aid to work with young homeless people, helping to feed them and give them shelter. the Blewetts also assisted several American draft dodgers during their transition to emigrating to Canada. In 1969, they went to Mexico City and became fascinated with the history of the Mayan people. They drove down to the Yucatan Peninsula to visit Mayan ruins and ended up renting a cabin there at the Isla Mujeres. In '84, they actually built a house there where they went every Christmas. Duncan and June decided to marry themselves on the roof of the Canadian Embassy in Mexico City by just going up and saying their vows to each other and presenting them each with a ring. They'd driven down to meet Timothy Leary. However, he and Duncan were to write several articles together since they'd both given LSD to prisoners and wanted to compare notes. Unfortunately, at that time, Leary was being deported, so when they arrived, the meeting never took place. When they returned to Regina, Duncan's mother insisted they have a proper wedding, so they had a private wedding ceremony assisted by the university chaplain in the home of his nephew and niece. In the summer of 1973, they drove to northern Saskatchewan and built a cabin with help from Cree Indians on a fly-in island 30 kilometers from the village of L'Orange. They had to go on a float plane. From 73 to 92, they would spend most summers there for privacy with only a canoe and a psychedelic motorboat for transportation. They claimed they liked to be able to go out canoeing naked because they didn't have to worry about neighbors. Arthur Mackay and his wife Lori, though, were 4 kilometers away and would visit. Duncan would ride up there during the day, chop wood, go fishing, and their children would also come up and spend time with them. For June Blewett's thesis, she was counting the number of specific words used in therapy session using a 3-way analysis of covariance method. Just before she finished, she thought it was so boring and restricted that nobody would ever read it, so she told her thesis committee she wanted to throw it out and get a totally new topic. So in the fall of '71, Blewett took a sabbatical, and he and June traveled in a Volkswagen van and lived in a dozen counterculture communes for 4 months in rural British Columbia. June used the participant observer method to live and participate in various communes, interviewed members on the advantages and disadvantages of setting up and organizing loosely structured groups who wanted to live a simplified and self-sufficient lifestyle. Most of these people were not poor people who couldn't afford to live in places, but they were middle-class, well-educated young people with a college degree. This resulted in her doctoral thesis called Practices and Attitudes in Counterculture Communes in British Columbia, and she received her PhD in 1974 from the University of Regina. June worked as a therapist while completing her doctorate and entered a private practice in several different places, such as the Wascona Rehabilitation Hospital and the Regina Mental Health Clinic. Later, they bought their own building and set up a private practice where they advertised 3 psychologists, no waiting, and they had a different person on each floor. June often worked with battered wives and incest victims and claims that 1/4 of the time she never charged for her services. Um, 73 to 74, Duncan took wasn't a sabbatical, it was actually a leave of absence. And they tried to work for New Carlton Industries, which was going bankrupt. They partnered with their former student, Robert Osborne, who never finished his degree, but made over $1 million by investing in a company which made container shipping crates out of England. And they used Maslow's Eutychian management principles of kindness, sharing, and generosity to improve employee morale and reduce theft and vandalism in company warehouses. Although they could have stayed, after a year they wanted to return to Canada, and then June renounced her U.S. citizenship. Sorry. Psychotronics, this is a term I didn't know before. This was coined in 1967 and encompassed the field of parapsychology. It was to use telepathy, clairvoyance, and psychokinesis in order to discover new principles of nature. But against the background of the Cold War, it was claimed it was using for spying, that people were doing mind reading. And a lot of the research was conducted in Eastern Europe and Russia. Duncan and June attended some of the conferences in Prague. When Duncan presented a paper, June had a miscarriage and was taken to an emergency room in a Prague hospital. Afterwards, they flew to North Africa to stay with friends to recover. In '75, they went to Monte Carlo to present another paper and invited to a champagne reception given by Prince Rainier and Grace Kelly. Duncan wrote a book in psychotronic engineering as a way of accessing the mind and spirit, and he's convinced that the spirit is the central organ of the psychic energy circulatory system. It was a little New Age mystic. This book was 50 pages long, written in the 80s and never finished in the 80s, but never published. In 1965, LSD was only made available for approved research purposes, and by 1969, it was declared a narcotic scheduled drug and banned, even for medical purposes in Canada. Although Blewett continued to smoke marijuana and use some other drugs, all the research programs came to a halt. No agency would fund the research. LSD went from being a wonder drug in the 1950s to a scapegoat for many social issues in the 60s, including the civil rights movement, the rise of feminism, free love sit-ins, anti-war protests, drug use by college-age youth, and political dissent. Humphrey Osmond moved back to the U.S. Abe Hoffer was denied a psychiatry position at the University of Saskatchewan, but at one time, Weyburn, Saskatchewan was a world center for psychedelic research in the world. But due to its location, more people have heard of Timothy Leary and his stuff at Harvard. Only recently have these studies in LSD actually being approved again. Blewett's interests over time gradually became more and more on the fringe of the scientific discipline of psychology. It already explored psychedelics, perennial philosophy, parapsychology, ESP, communal group living, encounter groups, altered states of consciousness, new psyche and management, and made a proposal for an institute of studies in normal psychology, actually a forerunner of today's positive psychology, when he maybe went off the deep end. His next book was to be entitled An Induction Renaissance Model of Psychic Energy Dynamics, and it was supposed to combine quantum physics and altered states of consciousness, and he presented it in a series of 17 different postulates. Some of them are like positive and negatively charged forms of psychic energy results from the different direction of psychic energy within an individual system. Psychic energy has a psychomagnetic effect analogous to the effect of a magnet. The book was never finished. He did complete a final paper on stress-induced occupational burnout on his last half sabbatical in 1981. Here's a picture of Duncan Blewett when he retired in 1986. Blewett retired in '86. His wife retired a year later. They moved to Gabriola Island off the coast of Vancouver, which was accessible only by a 45-minute car ferry ride from, it might have been Campbell River, not Nanaimo. They continued to spend the winters in the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. He still attended humanistic psychology conferences, often at the University of West Georgia, which was another humanistically inspired department. Just recently, they have the first PhD in humanistic psychology in North America down in West Georgia. Here's some pictures of June and Duncan Blewett on Gabriola Island after he moved there. Blewett does look sort of like a visionary where he climbed to the top of a mountaintop here, doesn't he? Here's Duncan and June sailing off into the sunset on a boat. Another picture of Blewett in retirement. He looks like he's in an altered state there. Still smiling after all these years? If you took LSD for several decades, you'd be smiling too, right? In 2005, he suffered a stroke and remained at home under June's care, living fabulously in the moment and to the end. He passed away on February 24, 2007, and a memorial service was held a month later. June Blewett then moved to Port Medway, Nova Scotia, but continues to spend the winters on the Yucatan Peninsula. I'm indebted to June for much of the background information on this. Here's a picture of St. Duncan ascending up into heaven to be with the angels here from the Institute for Zero Gravitation. And it says, your source of elation for the new millennium. There's supposed to be audio for this, but sorry it's not coming through. But this is an interview with Duncan Blewett towards the end of his life where he says that most of the people who oppose LSD had never tried it or never spoken to people who had. So he does sound quite thoughtful when he talks about that. What is his legacy? He was certainly a rebel in the traditional establishment of psychology. Called the Canadian Timothy Leary, he initiated many of the LSD research projects to help treat alcoholics and schizophrenics. As founder and chair of the University of Regina Psychology Department, he endeavored to establish the first humanistically-oriented program in Canada. Although trained conventionally in statistical procedures for personality assessment, his wide range of interests led him far afield to fringe areas that we've mentioned about psychedelic drugs, parapsychology, psychotronics, perennial philosophy, psychic energy dynamics, communal living groups, and eventually as a mystic. His book, The Frontiers of Being, stands along Maslow's The Psychology of Being in exploring the nature and limits of human consciousness of what he called transcendental man. And then I just list a number of references that I've used for his talk. So thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, John. I guess we'll take some opportunity to ask some questions. We don't need our hand so.
Yes.
Two questions. One is a fairly dry question, and the other one I'm actually very interested to hear whether you or maybe Buddy know the answer to this question. The dry question, what was the outcome of the publications where they used nicotine-enhanced LSD to treat schizophrenia? And the more interesting question is, did that meeting with Leonard Cohen here at the U of R happen at the psych department, and what happened during that meeting? I don't know.
Okay.
It didn't happen? Or?
Well,
I don't know anything about
many of the early studies with nicotinic acid and LSD actually had some good initial results. In fact, they showed there was an improvement of 50% against relapse rate in alcoholics. And for people who were prisoners, they got new insight in their life, and there was a lower incidence of recidivism. And even some of the schizophrenics felt like they had gone over the edge, and now they were more motivated to improve. The problem was they claimed they didn't use randomized clinical trials. And of course they claim, how can you give LSD to one person and sugar water in the other and not know the difference? It's almost hard to do that. The thing with Leonard Cohen is he came on campus and he came over, he wanted to get some LSD. He'd heard about it. He was told, you got to go see Duncan Blewett. So he went to see Blewett in his office, and Blewett was just about to leave for a department meeting. He says, I can't help you now, but we could have lunch and talk this afternoon. Why don't you just come to the department meeting with me? So here Leonard Cohen comes into the department meeting, and they bring up a few issues, and he says, Leonard, what do you think? What do you think we should do? Leonard's going, well, life's a song, but... people like Alan Watts came on the campus. The Maharishi yoga that the Beatles went to would come on the campus. Blewett would always bring guest speakers to his classes. You never knew who he was going to bring. One time he brought someone who was just released from the Kingston Penitentiary, who'd been there for 10 years, to talk to the students about what it was like to now be out in society after 10 years behind bars. So maybe today you have to get permission to bring special speakers on campus, but students never knew what to expect, so it was always interesting and never boring. So some of you are former students of Duncan Blewett's. Do you remember any anecdotes from his class?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I grew up in Ontario, and when people grow up somewhere else and end up in Regina, you know, you're commonly asked, well, how did you end up in Regina? So I ended up in Regina because the summer of 1970, I discontentedly traveled from the University of Toronto out west for a break, and I was sitting on English Bay Beach when a guy walked by, and he kind of looked over at me, and he came over, we started talking, and he was a student from the U of R in psychology. And he started telling me about this guy named Duncan Blewett. And I was very unhappy at the U of T. It was an experimental university. We weren't studying people there, and I wanted to study about people. And I just decided to move to the University of Regina and find this Duncan Blewett guy. And I did. That was 1970, and I've been here since. Now, I was in third year when I came in 1970, and Duncan wasn't teaching that year, so I didn't meet him. And then the next year I was ready, but that's when they went on sabbatical, 1971, as your talk explained. And so I didn't meet him until 1978, when I went back to grad school. But I was in advanced personality theory, which you didn't list as one of his classes.
Okay.
Buddy Wynn, who's sitting over there. And it was an absolutely magnificent class. There was a selection of readings, I think maybe 8 different readings from, as you explained, a variety of sources, not just traditional psychologists. And we were to read these articles. They were advanced articles, and then journal a response, like analyze the ideas, the thoughts, and put ourselves, and then apply it to our own development. And it was an absolutely magnificent experience to analyze your own personality. So it was advanced personality theory. And it was extremely formative for me. I went on and developed a marvelous career as, first of all, a clinical child psychologist, and then a family therapist, and had my own practice for 20 years. And I really credit probably that class in 1978, and many other classes from profs at the time. Studied advanced developmental psych with Joe Schubert, who's over there, that same, back in grad school. And Joseph talked a lot with us about genetics, heredity, and environment. And, you know, it's just a marvelous time at U of R. Very diverse ideas. And
do you still have the paper you wrote?
you know, I do. I saved my notes from that class, and I haven't probably looked at them in a very long time.
You should donate them to the archives.
I could, yeah. The archives were here.
By the way, the archives here has a large collection of materials which June Blewett and I guess Duncan donated there, and
of course, I have a copy of The Frontiers of Being.
Do you?
I know how valuable it is.
Yes. Yes.
Start with it for $75.
Put it on Kijiji, and you know you might pay for a night out or something. So, any of you current students, had you heard the name Duncan Blewett when you were in classes here recently? So, for some of you, you may be hearing this for the first time.
Yes. There's always been lots of sort of rumors about the prestigious past of the university, the ins and outs, ups and downs, and how interesting it was. But a lot of this story, certainly in the narrative form here, is the first time I've heard it. It's very fascinating, very interesting. Wonderful.
Well, I'm hoping to expand it at least into an article or book chapter, and if I get really inspired, maybe a book. So we'll see what happens in the next year or two. But it's something I didn't know before, and what I try to do is take some of the famous Canadian psychologists from the mid-20th century and make them known to present-day students.
Well, I was also a client of June's in therapy, and that's actually how I met him. I got back to grad school and met Duncan, and then I went on to be close personal friends and visited them at all their beautiful homes, as you say.
Okay.
And they were wonderful people to know and to be able to sit around with Duncan. And you're right, I think there was many times when he was off AD then somewhere, but he was never boring to listen to, and he just had these wonderful meandering conversations that were so uplifting. That's the only word I can describe it.
Thank you. You had a comment right here?
Well, I'm a retired elementary educator, but before I taught, I was a psychiatric nurse. So I was down in Weyburn when Osmond was down there, and there were little signs on the bulletin boards to come and take LSD. And I always missed it. I was always on the wrong shift. After I graduated, I worked 5DE at the University Hospital, and Hoffer was one of the psychiatrists there, and I was on his team. So I got to sit with some of his alcoholics, and the usual routine was he administered the LSD in the morning, and he usually sat for the first 2 to 4 hours, and then we sat with the rest of usually a full 24 hours. So I missed taking LSD there because, again, on the bulletin board were all these little signs. Hoffer really wanted all of his nurses to have experienced the drug themselves, because then we would know what was going on with the patients as we sat with them. So then I came to Regina and took a degree at the old campus. And so I finally got my LSD. Dunk set.
Wow. So was it a spiritual reawakening?
Actually, I was a dud. We did it properly. I had all these art books and all the music, and I just took it and just laid on the couch for 8 hours, and then kind of had an hour that I recall at the end. He had taken peyote in his milkshake to start with. My husband was there and a master's student, so I was well taken care of, but I just laid on the couch and did my thing.
Oh, well, I'm jealous here.
Yeah.
Anyone else have any memories or experiences with him? Now, Mae Smith is here, and your husband, Colin Smith, was involved in some of the early research with alcoholics. Do you remember anything from that time?
Well, I know he published 3 papers, very much concerned with doing proper scientific research and controlled studies. So, I don't know what more I could add.
Did your husband ever take LSD?
Oh, yes.
And he offered it to you?
Once.
Mm-hmm. So, now remember, it was legal back then. It was being given out free. They were encouraging everybody to try it. It was, it was all for medicinal purposes, so to speak, right? And for research, and you felt like even if you didn't totally enjoy the experience, you were sort of helping out, advance the realms of science or something like that.
They were very careful at the University Hospital. It was all done in a very professional manner and very much on a research basis. So it was...
But they had sign-up boards, and then you had to sign a risk statement that you understood the risks involved, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So...
But you were always babysat formally by a doctor when you took.
So... Anyway, I appreciate all of you coming out for this talk, and it's been my pleasure to spend a week here on the Regina campus.
I can speak for myself, and I think a lot of our colleagues and students, a lot of us did not know anything about all this history. So for us to know about our department in its former days valuable, and we really appreciate Dr. Connor's contribution to coming today and telling us about ourselves. And thank you very much.
Okay. Let me see. Buddy, is Jack here today?